The studio lights were colder than they looked on camera. Alan Dershowitz sat tall, posture crisp, his hands folded neatly over a stack of annotated case files. Across from him, Jasmine Crockett adjusted her mic, eyes steady, breath even. The room wasn't packed, but it didn't have to be. Millions were already watching through screens, waiting for sparks. This wasn't supposed to be a battle. The network had pitched it as a spirited legal discussion. But everyone knew what they really meant, a generational clash. Harvard pedigree versus courtroom grit. Dershowitz had come armed with precedent, status, and 60 years of polished TV debate experience. But Crockett, she came with memory. With fire, with something to prove, and nothing to lose. "Let's begin," the moderator said, trying to smile through the tension. Within minutes, Dershowitz made his move. "Well, with all due respect, Representative Crockett," he said, voice cool but slicing, "I understand you have legal training, but your courtroom experience hardly compares to someone who's argued before the Supreme Court." Jasmine didn't blink. The air shifted slightly. Not in panic, but recognition. "And while you're certainly passionate," he continued, "passion doesn't replace jurisprudence." There it was. Crockett leaned forward, just slightly. The camera caught it. Her eyes didn't waver. But her tone, measured, razor-sharp, cut through the room. "Mr. Dershowitz," she said, "I may not have taught at Harvard, but I've defended clients whose names never made it into law school hypotheticals. I've stood next to people when the stakes weren't academic, they were survival." The moderator tried to pivot. Too late. "Let me ask you this," Crockett pressed, "how many mothers have you had to call at 2 a.m. to tell them their son might not come home? How many housing court hearings have you sat through while judges rolled their eyes at people living on $9 an hour?" Dershowitz opened his mouth, but nothing came. "This isn't about credentials," she said. "It's about consequences." The feed exploded. Twitter lit up. TikTokers clipped the moment before the commercial break even hit. One caption read, "Alan tried to lecture, Jasmine brought reality." And that was just the opening move. Dershowitz reached for his water, the practiced flick of an old pro buying time. But something had shifted, and he knew it. This wasn't a courtroom where he controlled the narrative. This was live, raw, and Jasmine Crockett had just flipped the dynamic. The audience wasn't waiting for law, they were waiting for truth. And she delivered it like a witness under oath. "Well," he said finally, attempting to regain the rhythm, "we can all agree that the law must remain objective. Personal experience, while emotionally compelling, can't dictate national policy." Crockett didn't smile. She didn't flinch. Instead, she tapped her index finger on the desk, once. Deliberate. Sharp. "No," she said quietly, "but ignoring lived experience has dictated policy for centuries." A pause. That kind of pause that rewrites the room. "You want to talk about the law?" she continued. "Let's talk about the law that made it legal to redline black neighborhoods for decades. The law that locked up poor kids for weed while CEOs got rich off dispensaries. The law that allowed corporations to poison water in Flint but protected their shareholders." The moderator leaned back, visibly stunned. Dershowitz blinked. Crockett was just getting started. "I know what law school teaches," she said, voice rising, not in volume, but in power. "I also know what it doesn't. It doesn't teach you how to sit with a family who just lost their home because a developer found a loophole. It doesn't teach you how to translate justice to someone who's never seen it." And then the line. "Your credentials are impressive," she said, eyes locked on him, "but credentials without conscience? That's just privilege in a robe." The audience, a mix of young activists, journalists, and legal students, erupted in a sharp, collective gasp. Dershowitz leaned back. His confidence wasn't gone, but it had been tested, rattled. Crockett had landed a direct hit, not by shouting, not by shaming, but by making the abstract personal. Unavoidable. Backstage, producers were already cutting the clip for primetime rotation. And Jasmine? She hadn't even opened her binder yet. Alan Dershowitz shifted in his chair, the subtle twitch of a man calculating his next move. He wasn't used to being challenged, certainly not like this, and definitely not by someone half his age with twice the public momentum. He smiled, but it didn't touch his eyes. "Congresswoman Crockett," he said, measured and slow, "you speak passionately. But passion doesn't rewrite precedent. And for all the wrongs you've listed, the legal system still stands. It's the best in the world." Jasmine folded her arms. "Then why," she asked, "does it serve some like a shield, and others like a sword?" The room froze. "You say the system stands," she said, voice calm but coiled. "But who does it stand on? Because in my district, it stands on evicted mothers, on over-policed teenagers, on people who've been arrested more times than they've been heard." Dershowitz interjected, "That sounds more like a failure of governance than of jurisprudence." "And yet," Jasmine shot back, "when the governance fails the people, it's the courts that decide whether they get justice, or just delay." She leaned forward. "I'm not here to burn down the law," she said. "I'm here to demand that it serve everyone, not just the ones who can afford your hourly rate." Gasps again. The moderator's cue cards were forgotten. "You say I'm emotional," Jasmine continued. "But isn't that what justice is supposed to be? A system that feels when people are hurt? That responds? Because if law has no empathy, then what the hell are we building?" Dershowitz's mouth tightened. He reached for his pen, but didn't write. And then Jasmine reached for her binder, not for notes, but for names. "This," she said, flipping open a tab, "is Akeem. Arrested 5 times before 18, for walking home from school through the wrong zip code. Never convicted. But now? Can't get a job. Can't get housing." She slid a printed photo across the table. "This," she said again, "is law without soul." For the first time, Dershowitz didn't reply. He just stared at the photo. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was loaded. Heavy. Unforgiving. And Jasmine? She didn't blink. The silence lingered, tense and tangible. Even the camera crew held their breath, unsure if they were capturing a debate, or a reckoning. Alan Dershowitz sat still, eyes briefly locked on the image Jasmine had placed before him. The glossy print of a young black teen in a borrowed suit, standing outside a courthouse, haunted the table like a ghost no one had invited, but everyone now saw. Jasmine leaned back. She wasn't triumphant. She wasn't smiling. This wasn't sport. It was exposure. "I didn't bring Akeem's story for effect," she said. "I brought it because people like him are why I ran. Why I left the comfort of private practice. Why I sat in rooms where judges mispronounced my clients' names and never apologized." She looked across at Dershowitz, her voice steady. "You want to question my credentials?" she asked. "Then understand what they cost me. I didn't inherit access. I didn't network into courtrooms. I survived my way into them." A murmur of agreement rippled from behind the cameras. A floor manager nodded slightly, as if Jasmine had just voiced a truth he'd never heard aloud. But Dershowitz, always sharp, wasn't finished yet. "I don't question your intelligence," he said, "but politics isn't the courtroom. You can't legislate with sentiment." Jasmine cocked her head. "Sentiment," she repeated, tasting the word like a sour note. "You call what I shared sentiment? That's the luxury of distance, Mr. Dershowitz." She turned to the camera now, direct, unwavering. "If you think a system that jails trauma and fines poverty can be fixed without feeling, then you're not talking about reform. You're talking about preservation." The comment section online exploded. Viewers flooded Twitter. She didn't raise her voice. She raised the bar. Dershowitz blinked. "That's all I needed to see. This isn't a debate, it's a dismantling." Even late-night talk shows began running with the clip, looping Jasmine's stare down with headlines like, Crockett goes constitutional, and leaves Dershowitz defensive. But back on set, Jasmine wasn't thinking about memes or trending tabs. She looked at the moderator. "You wanted a discussion about justice," she said. "Now let's talk about how power hides behind language. Like calling inequality, tradition, or calling someone like me, unqualified." And then she added, almost as an afterthought, "But not really. I didn't come here for applause. I came to make the law feel real again." And suddenly, Dershowitz realized. This wasn't just a conversation. It was a shift. Dershowitz reached for his notes, the ones with bullet points and legal jargon, terms that once commanded every room he entered. But tonight, they felt flimsy. Outdated. Jasmine Crockett had shifted the conversation from theory to testimony, and now every word he spoke risked sounding detached, academic, irrelevant. "Let's be clear," he began, adjusting his glasses, "credentials don't negate scrutiny. That's the job of a republic. To question. To challenge." Jasmine nodded once, calm. "Then let's challenge everything." Her voice wasn't raised, but the room leaned in. She gestured to the moderator, who passed her the stack of documents she'd brought, highlighted, underlined, color-coded like a prosecutor preparing to dismantle a defense. "You've published dozens of legal texts," she said to Dershowitz. "And in 2011, you wrote that civil liberties are best protected when courts remain neutral and unsentimental. That neutrality, sir, is a myth when lived experience is ignored." Dershowitz's lips parted, about to interject, but Jasmine held up one page. "Here's a court ruling from 1993, State vs. Roderick Black. A 16-year-old tried as an adult for stealing groceries. The prosecutor used the word predator in opening statements. The boy was sentenced to 6 years. She placed the page on the table. He died in prison, she added flatly. Her words didn't rise. They sank, like stone dropped in still water. "Now tell me again," Jasmine said, eyes narrowing, "how neutrality helps the dead." For the first time all night, Dershowitz looked shaken. Because what she was building wasn't just a rebuttal, it was a record. And the internet was watching. Clips of the exchange were already circulating with captions like, "Dershowitz brought the Constitution, Jasmine brought the consequences." When experience speaks, theory listens. But inside the room, it was quieter. Stephen Colbert, sitting just off camera as a guest panelist, muttered under his breath, "That's not a lawyer talking. That's history in real time." Jasmine turned one more page. It wasn't a case file. It was a photo. Hers. Age 19. Standing outside the courthouse where she first interned as a clerk. Behind her, a protest. In front of her, a clipboard and shaking hands. "I didn't come to politics from legacy," she said. "I came from sidewalks and courtrooms and public buses with broken seats." Then, turning back to Dershowitz, she added, "So if you're going to question my credentials, start with the ones that aren't on paper. Because that's where real representation begins." The moderator went quiet. The studio lights didn't. And the debate wasn't over. It had just been redefined. There was a brief silence, but it wasn't the awkward kind. It was reverent. The kind of pause that fills a room when something undeniable has just been said, when the floor doesn't creak, the air barely moves, and even the people who disagree feel the weight of the moment. Alan Dershowitz leaned back slightly, one hand resting on the arm of his chair, the other curled beneath his chin. He wasn't rattled in the way a novice might be, he was a veteran of conflict, but even veterans know when the terrain has shifted. And Jasmine had redrawn the map. The moderator cleared his throat. "Mr. Dershowitz, would you like to respond?" He nodded slowly. "I respect the Congresswoman's experience, her story, her commitment. But legal precedent is not about individual emotion. It's about structure. About predictability. And if we abandon that, we abandon democracy itself. He thought it was a solid counter. It wasn't. Jasmine didn't even blink. You speak of democracy, she said, but what is democracy if it doesn't evolve? If it refuses to listen to the very people it claims to serve? Her voice was level, but the impact was sharp. I'm not asking to abandon the law. I'm asking to interrogate how it's been used, and who it's failed. Because if predictability means predictable harm to the same communities over and over again, then what you're defending isn't democracy. It's hierarchy. That line hit like thunder. The control room lit up, producers signaling to each other, clipping the quote in real time, already imagining the viral reel. Jasmine Crockett, what you're defending isn't democracy. It's hierarchy. On Twitter, hashtags sparked before she'd even finished the sentence. Back at the table, Colbert leaned into the mic with a half-smile. Congresswoman, are you sure you're not running for something bigger? Laughter. But Jasmine didn't take the bait. I'm not running, she said, eyes still on Dershowitz. I'm representing. That line was quieter, but somehow louder. Dershowitz sat back. His intellect was still intact. His legacy still vast. But in this moment, his grip on the room had slipped. Not from incompetence, but because Crockett had taken something abstract and made it immediate. She didn't come to dismantle law. She came to humanize it. And in doing so, she had revealed something deeper. This wasn't about credentials. It was about credibility. And Jasmine had more than enough of both. Alan Dershowitz adjusted his tie, a subtle move, nearly imperceptible. But to those watching closely, it wasn't a gesture of comfort. It was recalibration. A signal. He had just realized this wasn't going to be a battle of case law. It was going to be a reckoning. I've taught constitutional law for over 5 decades, he began, the cadence of a professor settling into lecture mode. And one of the greatest dangers I've seen, especially in the modern age, is when emotion outweighs evidence. He paused, letting it hang like a warning. Jasmine didn't flinch. She nodded, not in agreement, but in readiness. Emotion outweighs evidence, she repeated, her tone calm but steely. Let's talk about evidence, Professor. She reached into her folder and pulled out a printout, small text, highlighted in yellow and blue. This is a Department of Justice report from 2020. It outlines the disproportionate sentencing lengths for black and brown defendants compared to white defendants charged with identical crimes. That's not emotion. That's data. The air in the studio tightened. And this, she continued, holding up a second page, is from a bipartisan commission showing how bail policies across multiple states keep poor defendants, many of whom haven't even been convicted, in jail for weeks or months simply because they can't pay. She looked him square in the eye. If you think that's just emotion, then maybe you've been reading too many books and not enough lives. The audience didn't cheer, but they shifted. You could hear breaths being held, postures straightening. The energy had turned. Dershowitz leaned forward, his voice low but firm. You're arguing from anecdotes. Law is built on precedent, not passion. But Jasmine was already moving forward, both physically and rhetorically. Anecdotes, she said. The only reason you can call them that is because people like me have to keep showing up and repeating them. Until someone with power stops treating them like footnotes. Then she lowered her voice, not out of weakness, but intent. You said law needs predictability? Well, here's what's predictable. Black families lose homes faster in economic downturns. Black defendants face higher bail. Black communities get fewer public defenders, more policing, and less infrastructure investment. She wasn't raising her voice. But her presence was roaring. And Dershowitz, world-renowned legal scholar, TV regular, best-selling author, sat silently, pen in hand, no longer certain what page this story was even on. Because Jasmine Crockett wasn't quoting the Constitution. She was reinterpreting it. And she wasn't done. Jasmine placed the final sheet down, not with force, but with finality. "You want to talk precedent, Professor?" she asked, her voice like a scalpel, cutting without raising volume. "Let's talk about Plessy. Let's talk about Korematsu. Let's talk about the legal decisions that carved injustice into stone." She leaned forward slightly. "The law has a history. And not all of it is noble." Dershowitz didn't respond right away. For once, his eyes weren't scanning the room or the cameras, they were locked on her. He wasn't facing a pundit, or a protester. He was facing a lawyer who knew the system from both sides, the courtroom and the eviction line. "I respect history," he finally said, cautiously. "But I fear we're losing objectivity." Jasmine sat back. "Objectivity," she repeated softly, like she was testing the taste of the word. "You know what objectivity looks like in courtrooms across America? It looks like public defenders managing 200 clients at a time. It looks like prosecutors with unlimited resources and jurors who've never set foot in the neighborhoods they're judging." A quiet murmur rose from the back of the room. Not outrage. Agreement. Recognition. Jasmine tapped her binder once. "And since we're being objective, Professor, let's look at your own record. You've defended the powerful for decades, presidents, billionaires, men accused of crimes against women and children. You always say everyone deserves a defense. I agree. But when was the last time you defended someone who couldn't pay you?" That stopped him cold. "See, I fight for people whose names will never be on a churn. Whose stories won't get optioned into a Netflix series. People who don't have Harvard grads on speed dial, just a public defender trying to juggle 10 cases at once while feeding their own kids on a government salary." She turned, just slightly, toward the camera. "Everyone wants to talk about the law like it's a scale. Balanced. Blind. But anyone who's ever stood on the wrong side of a courtroom door knows that scale tips, hard. And always in the same direction." Dershowitz inhaled sharply. "Are you accusing me of being complicit in systemic bias?" She held his gaze. "No," she said. "I'm accusing you of pretending it doesn't exist." The room froze. It was the kind of moment no script could write, no strategist could prepare for. Not a takedown. A confrontation. And more than that, a revelation. Jasmine didn't need applause. She had something far more dangerous. The truth. And she was just getting started. The moderator, frozen for most of the exchange, finally attempted to intervene. "Let's stay civil," he muttered, half-heartedly. But no one moved. No one spoke. All eyes were still locked on Jasmine, and on Alan Dershowitz, who now looked less like the unshakable legal mind of Harvard and more like a man realizing he had entered the wrong arena. Jasmine glanced sideways at the moderator. "I am being civil," she said, measured. "Civility isn't silence. It's clarity. And clarity, today, is uncomfortable." Then she turned her attention fully back to Dershowitz. "You've built a life on the idea that the law is neutral," she said. "But neutrality only benefits those who've never had to beg for fairness." The audience stirred again. Not loud. Just restless, like a crowd watching something they didn't expect but couldn't turn away from. "You want case law?" she asked. "Here's a case. Tamir Rice. 12 years old. Shot in under 2 seconds. No indictment." Dershowitz opened his mouth, but she didn't give him the space this time. "Here's another. Khalif Browder. Accused, not convicted. 3 years in Rikers. 2 in solitary. He hung himself after release. No compensation. No accountability. Just, the system working." She stepped closer, not to intimidate, but to refuse retreat. I don't bring these names up because they're gotcha moments. I bring them up because they're people. And because every time someone like you shrugs and says, that's not the law's fault, what you're really saying is, it's not your problem. Her words weren't loud, but they rang. Dershowitz looked down at his notes. For once, he didn't seem to have the next line ready. Jasmine, meanwhile, let the silence hang. She was comfortable there. That was the difference. She had lived in the silence between injustice and response. Between verdict and closure. Between tragedy and indifference. Finally, she said, you questioned my credentials. But this moment? This clarity? This ability to speak not just from books but from blood, sweat, and reality? She stepped back. That is my credential. Applause broke, not scripted, not staged. Just, human. And Dershowitz? He finally looked up. Not with fire. With respect. It was too late, though. The room had already chosen who they were listening to now. Outside the chamber, the hallway buzzed with reporters, interns, and aides, all murmuring versions of the same question, did you see that? Clips were already being uploaded. Phones lit up across DC, and hashtags began trending before Jasmine even left the building. One post read. Alan Dershowitz brought the law books. Jasmine brought the lived truth. And she won. Inside a quiet green room, Jasmine took a breath. Her hands were still. Her pulse was steady. Across from her, a junior staffer whispered, you just made history. Jasmine didn't smile. She simply replied, I didn't come to make history. I came to make space, for the rest of us. Meanwhile, Dershowitz sat in silence backstage. Not angry. Not bitter. Just, processing. His assistant handed him a bottle of water. He didn't touch it. She caught me flat-footed, he muttered. No, the assistant said, carefully. She didn't catch you. She showed you. The next morning, major news outlets couldn't decide what to call it. A reckoning? A takedown? A dialogue? But in barbershops, on college campuses, in late-night group chats, people weren't debating what it meant. They felt it. Because Jasmine hadn't just challenged a man, she had confronted a myth. The myth of objectivity. Of fairness detached from reality. She had drawn a line in the sand and dared the nation to look down and see where they stood. And quietly, without spectacle, something began to shift. Alan Dershowitz released a statement 2 days later. It didn't apologize. It acknowledged. I've spent decades studying the law. Yesterday reminded me that I still have things to learn from those living it. No interview followed. No media tour. Just silence. And for once, it spoke volumes. As for Jasmine? She got on a plane to Texas that evening. No press. No entourage. Just her mother waiting at the gate with a hug. You okay? Her mother asked. Jasmine nodded, tired but sure. Yeah. And I said what needed to be said. Her mother smiled. You always do. They walked out of the terminal together. And somewhere in America, another girl sat on her bed, watching the clip one more time, not because she needed to, but because it reminded her. She didn't have to wait for permission. Not anymore. In a world where credentials are used to silence, Jasmine Crockett proved that lived experience is power. Where Alan Dershowitz once stood unchallenged, she stood unshaken. She didn't yell. She didn't flinch. She simply spoke, and the room broke open. This wasn't just a moment of reckoning between two voices. It was a reminder that the law must answer to the people it claims to serve. And when those people finally speak back, even giants of the courtroom learn to listen. This wasn't a debate. This was a shift. And Jasmine Crockett didn't just win it, she defined it.